So let's talk about Acts 18, which was another part of the required reading for this week. You'll notice that in the first the first 8 verses of Acts 18, we see some more players in Paul's apostolic band, and then going out a little bit farther into verse 24, we see the introduction of this guy named Apollos, and Apollos, if you're interested, kind of figures in pretty strongly in Paul's writing of the first chapter of 1 Corinthians. He in fact says, Apollos planted, I watered, but God gave the increase. In other words, we're all co-laborers. Apollos did one thing, I did another thing, but any increase in the message of the gospel is a result of God's action. I think it's a good question. Why would I have you read Acts 18 after this stuff with Barnabas? Why is that important? Especially since Silas, who's introduced to us here in verse 5, we've seen him before, but he comes on the scene in Acts 18 in verse 5. He's Barnabas's replacement with Paul's apostolic band. And he accompanies Paul on the so-called second and third missionary journeys. He, in some ways, gets a even less kind of attention in the book of Acts than Barnabas does. Barnabas is introduced to us in chapter 4. Why? Well, one reason is because of something I mentioned kind of in the end of the reflection video, has to do with jealousies. There will always be stars of the show. And in the book of Acts, you have Jesus, you have Simon Peter, and you have Paul. These are the 3 stars of the show. And of course, Jesus is of a different ilk because he is the foundation upon which the message of the gospel is built, the death and resurrection of Jesus. And you see it over and over again in the speeches in the book of Acts. It has to do with the death and resurrection of Jesus. That is of central importance. And the ones who primarily tell that story are both Saints Peter and Paul. So there are these other players. Are they important? Absolutely, but they're not primary characters. To use Murphy's language, they're secondary characters in the book of Acts. Paul is a star in the New Testament era. He's a prolific writer. He, of course, is associated with Luke, who gives us the book of Acts and the Gospel of Luke. And he's a prolific defender of the gospel. He's a major voice in conceptualizing what the gospel is, what theology is, what the church is supposed to do. Paul's importance in the New Testament era is difficult to understate. Others are equals. They're just not the main ones that Luke is telling the story about. It's interesting, for example, in Acts 14:14, if you want to go back to that both Paul and Barnabas are called apostles. So Barnabas is not in the list in Acts chapter 1 of the apostles, including Matthias, who takes the place of Judas. Paul is not in that list either. Both are called apostles later on. Barnabas is an apostle, but he is not one of the ones about Luke frames most of the story. But Luke doesn't do that for other apostles either. John, there's a little bit about John, but early in the church's history, it's about Peter. And it's not about Thaddeus. It's not about Bartholomew, right? It's not about James, the son of Alphaeus, although he makes an appearance there in Acts 15. I'm sorry, that's James, the brother of John. James, the brother of Alphaeus, is, it's either that James or James, the brother of John, probably more likely James, the brother of John, that is martyred in Acts chapter 12. So these other folks, they don't play Andrew. We don't hear anything about Andrew, really. They don't play as great a part. But does that lead to jealousy? Shouldn't. We all have a part to play. So that's one of the reasons why I introduce you to this other apostolic band after Paul and Barnabas have split in Acts 18, because I think it's important to see a demonstration of how jealousies, if they had allowed it to, which apparently they did not, how jealousies could have doomed the early church. So even though there are a lot of players, Paul has the preeminence. I would say then, on the other end, what can happen sometimes if we're filled with jealousy is that we can allow that to kill our own contributions. You have a contribution that only you can make. I have a contribution that only I can make. And I think the fact that the story goes on in Acts 18, even without Barnabas, and Barnabas' story goes on, even though Paul is is obviously the main character in the second part of the book of Acts. If Barnabas had taken his ball and gone home, for example, then what happens? He doesn't make the contribution that he's supposed to make. If you take your ball and go home, if I take my ball and go home, then I don't make the contribution that I'm supposed to make. I see things in the text. I have values. I have issues that I want to investigate that maybe I'm the only one looking at. Or I may spark someone else to take my research a little bit farther. If you end up doing some research or facilitating research, you're going to have a part to play in that. It may not be. I'm working on a grant right now. I am not the project director. Even though I know, and the project director knows, that we're kind of co-equal. We're teammates on this thing. But because the grant application calls for one name to be submitted, it seemed more reasonable to both of us that his name is on it. I never like to be the hero of my own story. I'm just saying this is a way in which I'm trying to walk this out. What's important? What's important is that the work gets done. What's important is that I can help facilitate the research that we're going to do in service of this grant, and you get to do the same thing. And that brings us to something else that Fowler said on page 121, and kind of bringing it all together there. She talks about the dissemination of your work. Do your research, facilitate research, be a part of teams, whether they're ethical teams at the hospital or your healthcare environment, whatever it is. And then make sure that you follow through and kind of close the loop and let others benefit from the research that you've done. It's going to be amazing what's going to happen as you participate in facilitating or in actually doing research, how that's going to open up new ideas for research that you never thought would happen, and yet you get ideas, and more ideas come and more ideas come. So I just want to encourage you in that. So then to finish up, let's just finish up this week's video right now very quickly. What holds all this together? What I said earlier, in all roles and settings, that prepositional phrase, nurses in all roles and settings do these things. Barnabas and Paul, as well as others, they were trailblazers, establishing the Christian church wherever they went. Each one of them had a part to play, and each one of them had strengths and each one of them had weaknesses. Paul was never called the son of encouragement. Given my choice, I think that son of encouragement label is it's a pretty cool thing, and I kind of like to be that guy. Paul gets the glory, Barnabas facilitates. Paul, does he ever get the access to the church leaders in Jerusalem that he has without Barnabas? I'm not sure that ever happens. Barnabas plays a critical role in the foundation of the churches. So, nurses, however you serve the common good, you're all called to the same thing. You're all called to serve the common good. Some are going to serve in one role, some in another. Some of those roles have little to no glory established with them, except for that patient whose life was made better because you were in the room that day. So those are some thoughts about Murphy, about Fowler, about the Bible, and certainly about Barnabas. We'll see you next week as we wrap up.